Now, South Africa has a very difficult time understanding that it is in Africa. It's a very interesting, my mother, who, I grew up here on the Cape Flats, and my mother, I don't know how she got the money together, but she was determined to visit us, my wife and I, in New York at Cornell University, because she wanted to see her first grandson, wanted to be a witness. So she came, I picked her up at the airport, and waiting at our little apartment on campus were about 15, 16 friends of ours from everywhere on the continent of Africa. And they were going to give my mother a wonderful welcome, as she arrived. So they all dressed up in their flowing African garments and so on and so forth, and I came with my mother and the cases up the staircase. And as the door opened, one of my closest friends, David, he was from the Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, he sort of opened, he went to my mother with his flowing robes and he said, "Welcome, my sister from Africa." And if you know my mother looked him in the eye and she says, "Listen, let's just get one thing straight. I'm not from Africa, I'm from Cape Town." So, it was a bit embarrassing. It was a bit embarrassing, but David found that very, very funny. And one of the things that we struggle with is how to relate to the African continent. Some universities in this town, in this part of the country, call themselves all sorts of names, World-class African University, Afropolitan University. It's an attempt to hook up and to link to the ideal of simply being another African country and another African university. I also just want to say I am extremely delighted to see our colleagues here from Zimbabwe. You might not know this, but I left my university in California where I was doing my PhD, and my supervisor said, "Oh, just go into East Palo Alto and do your studies on schools there." I said, "No, I want to go to Zimbabwe because in Zimbabwe there was the beginnings of a model for education that we could use one day when we were free." So that's the way in which we thought at the time. And I have to tell you, to this day, I don't know how many people know this, Zimbabwe still has the best schools, despite the fact that the economy collapsed, despite the fact that the state is in disarray, and for a long time, the best schools in the continent is actually in Zimbabwe. So I went to recruit there every year when I was a vice chancellor, and I went to the top girls' schools there called Arundel Girls. And I went to Arundel, and I was early, so I went to the chapel, to pray for my sins, which are many. And as I sat in this quiet chapel waiting for the girls to come out for the talk, I picked up the hymn book. You will not believe, Pumla, what the first hymn was in Harare, in the hymn book at Arundel Girls. The first hymn was, "God Save Our Gracious King." Not even the Queen, the King. And I said, in South Africa, you'd have heard all these deflecting and in fact, useless remarks on decolonization, because we can't deal with the real things, so we talk about decolonization. There are some very real problems that Zimbabwe deals with and succeeded. So just so that you know, I spent 18 months in a place called Chunoi, just northeast of Harare, and I was absolutely graciously, wonderfully treated by my colleagues. For those of you who wonder why Zimbabwe does well relative to South Africa in terms of schools, it's very simple. It's actually 1954. The biggest mistake we made in South Africa was to take the schools away from the missions, the Lovedales, the Adamses, the Hill Towns, and so on, and we put it under the control of the white government. Big mistake. For some reason, Zimbabwe always kept its schools under the control of the Catholic churches and the Anglican churches. And that was your saving grace, if I may mix my metaphors and so on. Which sort of leads me to what I want to talk about today. So we're sort of just over 20 years after apartheid, and we're beginning to see in the 29,000 schools what I call in the subtitle of this talk, settled patterns of school desegregation, and that begins to tell us something about the prospects for social cohesion. Now you have to understand, By the time a white and black South African at the age of 18 come to university, they already messed up in their heads. Okay? Depending on which schools they went to, depending on the homes they grew up in, depending on the churches, mosques, synagogues that they went to, they either struggle greatly with social cohesion, with being together with others who don't look like them or pray like them or speak their language, or they're able to get together more easily. So you look to the schools, in a sense, as a place where you begin to develop what John Samuel calls the habits of democracy. Okay, you look to the schools. So what is it that we can, looking into the future, begin to see the likelihood of us as South Africans being able to live together and to learn together, and if we're lucky, to love together? What are those possibilities given these settled patterns of school desegregation in the country? So we look to schools to do that because the environment, as far as South Africa is concerned today, is toxic when it comes to race relations. If you just looked at the ways in which black South Africans versus white South Africans, with a few exceptions on each side, responded to the Ashwin-Willemse saga, it's really amazing that two groups of people can look at exactly the same 3 minutes and see two totally different things. The white people, by and large, see black petulance. The black people, by and large, see white racism. And I wrote about that today in Business Live and in the Times because I actually happened to have a long chat with Ashwin to find out what exactly, because I knew intuitively. I don't even know this guy's hometown. It's a place called Tessersdal in Caledon. If you grew up there, just by virtue of your birth there, you're disadvantaged. Okay, you're going nowhere. And so I knew that this guy, who I knew to be humble, hardworking, determined, I knew something must have happened for him to hak uit, as they say in Afrikaans, to lose it, to snap on public television. And of course, now we know, at least I know, why he snapped. But for South Africans, it's very difficult to look at the same event and come away with the same understanding of what clearly in this case was an unbelievable sense of racial condescension and dismissal by Nick and Nas, but you can read that in the article. And so from George Counts, who 150 years ago wrote the book, Dare the Schools Build a New Social Order, to my favorite curriculum theorist, Michael Appel, who recently wrote, Can Education Change Society? We look to schools in order to give us a sense not only of economy and society, but of social cohesion in particular. Now, before I get into these settled patterns, let me just make it very clear that the reality is that the majority of South African schools remain segregated after apartheid. So let's not fool ourselves here. There's a relatively small number of schools that are integrated in different ways. Most black schools are still black, okay? Whether it's Kayamandi or Umlazi or, Uitenhage and so on, take your pick. If you're in a black township school, on average, you are in a segregated school. In other words, those young black children who become young people, by the time they come to university, most of them, 80% of them, would only have had experiences of black education. So despite the fact that we are now after apartheid, it's a relatively small group of students who actually enjoy the benefits of learning in the same spaces as people who don't look like them, and so on. And by the way, let me just say this also via a very long introduction. One of the reasons schools so perfectly reflect society, and universities so perfectly reflect societies, I always feel sorry for vice-chancellors. You're supposed to change these 18-year-olds as if nothing happened before they got to you. It's very, very difficult, okay? It's extremely difficult because they not only come from communities where they are often troubled, they go into communities where they're troubled, and Professor de Villiers has to wave this magic wand and have everybody love each other in Huis Visser. I'm just using a random example. It doesn't quite work that way. And the problem is not the kids. I've worked with young black and white South Africans in 5 different universities. I can tell you the easiest thing to do is to change the minds of students. It's not difficult. The problem is you guys. It's you, the parents. In fact, let me just show you why you're the problem. Did you know that right now, I've done my math, 83% of you are sitting next to somebody who looks like you. Now, I'm sure you're going to tell me, I'm not a racist. I can see some of you who came in late say, "Dank die Vader," I just found myself next to, But 83% of you are sitting next to somebody who looks like you. And the problem is that if I dropped you as black and white balls from this roof, the probability that you'd end up in these patterns is almost zero. Okay? So you reflect, even unconsciously, choices by race. So how the hell must your kid suddenly become this wonderful non-racial, interracial citizen? It doesn't work like that. Okay? So you guys are the problem. I have very little I can do for you. Okay? But we can do a lot for these kids, provided, of course, their educational experiences approximate something close to learning and living together. Now, having said that, how do schools, in fact, desegregate in South Africa? Because after 1994, but even after 1990, there was a gradual movement for the former white schools to desegregate, okay? And the one thing we must first of all say is that the first schools to desegregate were, in fact, desegregated in 1976. Of all the years you could think of, they first desegregated in 1976, because the Catholic open schools decided that it was time to confront the state. And there's some pioneering studies done by Pam Christie and Dawn Butler, a partner, on exactly how those things happen. Now, the problem is if you suddenly desegregate, of course, you're going to have problems because people are not used to living together. I remember when, before my time at the Free State, when my predecessor wisely decided to integrate the residences, all hell broke loose. Because you take an 18-year-old guy who worked on a farm in Villiers or in Bothaville, and suddenly his only knowledge of black people are as laborers, okay? And you suddenly put him in the same res, not even the same room, and you tell him he must get together with other people. The kid goes bonkers. He doesn't know what to do, One of my funniest experiences with the Free State was seeing, boys especially, women don't have a problem. Women deracialize much more quickly than men. Men, there's something in the upbringing of males in this country that's really weird. And then they don't know, because I'm the first black person any of them see in authority, and they don't know what to call me, They know Wim is the wrong move, okay? Uncle, because I'm clearly not the uncle. Professor is a stretch because, what the hell are you doing here as a professor, And so one of them called me Wim Professor. He was trying. No, you got to give it to the guy. He's trying, to find his way. But those schools, in starting to desegregate the Catholic schools in 1976, they discovered how difficult this was, even though they all worked with the same theological script. But black schools stay black. And this tighter relationship between the past and the present has a lot to do with the spatial segregation of apartheid. So what happens, of course, is that by and large, white parents would send their kids to schools where they live. Black parents would send their kids to schools where they live. Why? Because it's safe, it's secure, it's cheaper than putting your kid in a taxi or a bus or a train to some other place. So by and large, that explains the fact that you still have largely black schools. Now, it turns out that those schools, with few exceptions, are also the weakest academic schools in terms of teacher qualifications, the predictability of the timetable, cognitive learning outcomes, of which the best research in the country, in fact on the continent, is done here at Stellenbosch with Safas van der Berg, Nick Spohr, and others. But what it does mean is that there is also no opportunities for interracial contact. Now, let's get more interesting. So it makes sense then, because of the spatial geography of apartheid, that you would have largely black schools for most. But, surprise, surprise, we still in this country have largely white schools. In fact, some all-white schools. And some of them are able to get away with it because of their class status. So if you take a school, one of my favorite schools in the country is a school called Afis, Seuns, Afrikaans Seuns Hoërskool. I remember the first time I visited there was hilarious, for me at least, because I came up, they were expecting a Jansen, but they weren't expecting me. So the secretaries, of course, looked at me as if, I was dragged in by the cat, and I was enjoying the moment. And the one asked me, wie is jy? Now, for my Zimbabwean friends, nobody asks you in Afrikaans, in that language, wie is jy, or who are you? There's normally a more sophisticated, respectful, who are you, etc. So, of course, I declared, and then eventually the principal came out, Pierre, I forget his name now, tall guy, used to play for number 15 rugby for South Africa. And here comes Pierre, and he looks at me, speaks Afrikaans, he refuses to speak English as a matter of faith. And, Pierre comes out and says to me, is jy Professor Jansen? Are you Professor Jansen? I said, yes, I am. He said, okay. I wish I could say this in Afrikaans, but I have to translate it. He says, well, welcome, he says, I can deal with you black people. It's the bloody English that drive me nuts, but sort of roughly. But here you have an all-white school, unapologetically in the middle of the country. And by the way, if you look at the history, which I did with the helicopter, by the way, when I wrote my book, Knowledge in the Blood, you have to go over the place to understand its layout. You actually have 2 English schools for 100 years old, Pretoria girls, Pretoria boys, and 2 Afrikaans schools right nearby. It's a direct reflection of what happened in the Boer War. I mean, they came out of that era, Afis Seuns and Afis Meisjes and so on and so forth. But here you have these schools, and the question is, why in a democracy, with the constitution we have, do we allow all white schools to exist? And these elite public Afrikaans schools exist simply because of their position with regards to rights and resources, material, legal, and political. And in that way, no matter what Lessufi, the MEC for Education, does there in his very muscular approach to schools, you can't do anything about it because of that particular affluence and that particular sense of rights that these elite public Afrikaans schools have. The other reason they're able to get away with that, there's no pressure, because there are so many schools in that area of high quality that students, black students in particular, are able to spread out and go somewhere else, which is not the case, as I'll show you in a moment, with rural Afrikaans, white Afrikaans schools. Now, it helps, of course, to use the Afrikaans language as a medium of exclusion, but you don't have to say it. You can claim constitutional rights, you can claim even ethnic rights, but you can get away with it, okay? And I've always said to people, you don't even have to make that argument. Consequentially, you're keeping out black kids. Whether or not that's an intention, we can debate. And so the struggle between language rights and racial access in the rural Afrikaans schools is a completely different matter, and I will come to that in a minute. Most white schools, like, for example, along the Wynberg to Woodstock corridor, if you just drove down the main road, going from Wynberg Girls and Boys all the way through Rondebosch, Claremont, Newlands, Mowbray, all the way up to Woodstock, you would find some of the most prestigious schools in the country and some of the most prestigious schools in the world. And almost all of those schools, with one exception, Rhodes, incidentally, Rhodes, are majority white schools, okay, and they kept that way intentionally, by the way, by 2 factors. The first factor is the catchment policy of the schools. So what the school governing body does is to make sure that the only children who attend that school are kids who live in the catchment area. Now, by and large, in a perfect world, that's not a problem. The problem is the people in the catchment area are all white, okay, because that's the way residential segregation works. So once again, you gain the benefit of this particular historical arrangement. Except, of course, that slowly but surely, there's a new class of people, an aspirant black middle class that moves in there. So you would always in those schools find 10, 15% black students, mainly from the middle classes, who have arrived. Rondebosch Boys is a very good example, since I know that school quite well. But the school remains effectively a white school. And then, of course, there are Afrikaans schools, and they have a very different political strategy, and that is to allow in what in South Africa curiously is called colored children. And I discovered in Stellenbosch, and only in Stellenbosch, people talk about brain mense. I said to my friend Herman Gilemi, what the fuck is brain mense? You know, I just don't get that language, I have to be honest. For those, I should tell my Zimbabwean friends that the notion of colored in South Africa, which you didn't have as a legal category, but the notion of colored here means mixed race. Now, of course, the danger of that is that there must be a pure race. The problem with that is you're then talking National Socialism. The problem with that is you're fucked. Okay, so this notion of colored identity is completely fictitious, but people take it to be real. And so by having a few Afrikaans-speaking colored students in your school, but predominantly white, is one way in which the Afrikaans schools deal with this in this category. And another, of course, is the white English schools that keep those numbers low. Now, why do they do that? I just had a 2-hour conference call before I got here with colleagues in some of the private white schools in Johannesburg. Why is this pattern sustained? For a very simple reason. Both in the United States and in South Africa, there is very good research on what they call a tipping point. That is, the moment the number of black students get to 30%, the white parents begin to leave, okay? And so you have the racial management of access in such a way that you keep those schools white, because if you don't, the school goes the other way and you lose your middle-class parents. And that, in fact, for all the gentility of the English, is a very deliberate strategy to control access in these white majority schools. The problem with those schools, of course, is you can't manage that for too long before you're going to have trouble. And that's exactly what happened at Pretoria Girls around the hair issue, at Sansusi over here in Newlands around the black hair issue, and there will be many, many more such confrontations, as happened at UCT when black African students reach a critical mass. And then, of course, you're going to have to stand up and deal with historical disadvantages and so on and so forth. Then there's a third category of schools, a settled pattern of segregation or desegregation, if you wish, and that is black-dominant former white schools. Now, this is a very interesting category of schools that's part of our studies at the moment across the country. And I'm thinking of a school like, for example, a school in Johannesburg that I worked very closely with over the years, and a wonderful, wonderful principal was there. And it was called Jeugheer Strydom. Now, if you know the Lion of the North, if you heard Jeugheer Strydom, you knew there's trouble. And they changed the school to a really cheesy name, Diversity High. I said to them, what a silly name for the school, Diversity High. But they had great support from open-minded white folk like, and so on, and this was really fantastic. The problem is it was a working-class white Afrikaans school, and I knew what was going to happen. And that's exactly what happened. That the kids then left the school. The more the taxis literally dropped off black kids from schools in Soweto in particular, the more the white parents left the school and took their kids to Alberton, who was called Alberton, which is across the road, which is the more white school, and so on and so forth. So here you have a category of schools, you'll find them around Cape Town as well, that were once white schools that are now effectively black schools, and all the white kids have left. And of course, that doesn't make for any prospect for social cohesion. And then what you also have as another category of schools is former white schools that are black dominant. In other words, they still have enough white students in order to claim that they look like the country. These are the genuine schools in my view. These are the schools that actually have the 80-20% or 70-30%. And you might ask, who are these schools? Invariably, they are parochial schools, in other words, church schools. So a very good example of this is Sacred Heart, which sort of sits on the edge of Yeovil and Hillbrow. And it's Sacred Heart, which has always had a very progressive principle year after year. And the white kids who used to go there, I remember the Slovis kids used to go there once people came back from exile. It was a school regarded by progressive white parents as the place you wanted your kid to be. And of course, they couldn't care less about race and this nonsense and so on. And so in those small, very small set of schools, probably not many in the country, you would find black students in the majority, but a visible presence of white students. And those, of course, are the kinds of schools one would like to have more of in the country, but for reasons I mentioned, you don't. Then there's another kind of integration in Tussen-Hakies. And this you will find most prominently in what is called in Port Elizabeth the northern areas. And those northern areas are places like Katanga, up to Bethelsdorp, and so on and so forth. So this is predominantly former colored schools, to use that language, in which the black kids flee the African schools because they are relatively much worse off. These schools are also struggling. But the African schools in Motherwell and so on are so bad that the parents exercise, you know, what I think is a completely irrational option. I think any parent would do that. You look for the better school that you can afford and you cross the road or the highway. The problem is, of course, those schools don't cross with the teachers, they don't cross with the resources. And for 2 years, those school teachers went on strike there. And I remember spending 2 days with those teachers, and I was heartbroken, you know, because they weren't racist. They were actually wonderfully open to having these students, but they said, now instead of having 40 kids, I've got 70 kids in the class, you know, and nobody's listening to us. Now, the Eastern Cape is probably one of the most corrupt. By the way, if you don't believe this, and you feel the need to be depressed, buy a book called How to Steal a City. It will seriously mess you up, you know, and it's an inside story of the Nelson Mandela Bay municipality. I mean, you know, before people used to steal and run away, you know, here they steal with their eyes wide open, you know, and sitting in the offices of power. And here, black African students obviously seek better opportunity, but they can't afford to go to grey high school, okay? But they can afford to go to the college school and so on and so forth. All of which, for me, are very, very positive moves, but it's very, very difficult without the movement of resources. So coming back to the question then, why do students migrate? Obviously, because parents are looking for better opportunities. Now, the truth is, whether it's broad economic migration or educational migration on a smaller scale, the way to fix this problem in the long run is, of course, to make sure that the schools work everywhere, okay? And make sure that children have access to high-quality schools all over the country. That's not going to happen in our lifetime. You can forget about that, because I don't believe this government really cares too much about the education of the poor. They don't. And so you're stuck with these arrangements in place. And what is happening now, of course, is the pressure on the receiving schools to begin to relax their criteria for access for especially black students, which has led to 2 or 3 very, very interesting legal cases. The one of which you would recall involved Rivonia Primary. And Rivonia Primary in Johannesburg said, well, we're actually full. Now, what they mean by full is we have 22 or 23 children per class. from the department's point of view, no, that's not full. You can take an extra kid, and you can take a lot more kids. And that, of course, is something that the courts normally rule in favor, not of the governing body's rights, which they have in terms of the Schools Act, but in terms of the higher law, which is the Constitution, which privileges access over anything else. Then, of course, you remember schools like Hoërskool Micro, or Laerskool Micro, there the question was, or these schools in Mpumalanga, like Ermelo, there the question was Afrikaans, where the school said, but we're an Afrikaans medium school, okay, and we will not create an English stream in order to take in more students. Well, that didn't go very far because eventually, again, the courts rule in favor of opening up the schools. Now, the reason these schools, as I suggested earlier, can't get away with murder the way Office does is simply because their parents are middle class and working class white Afrikaans-speaking parents. They don't have access to the legal resources, the material benefits of the big city schools, and so they lose. They lose that fight, and eventually, of course, they also put their children into other schools. So what does this, or these patterns, have to do with the possibility for social cohesion in our country? Well, the first thing we discovered is that desegregation is a very different proposition from integration, okay? In other words, bringing black and white students together in the same space, whether at school or university, is one thing. Making sure that they're able to get along together is a completely different proposition, okay? And so one of the great sociologists of the previous century, made the point that he's responsible for what they call the contact thesis, that if you put people together, young people together, under the right circumstances, they will be able to develop positive race relationships. The South African research is a very different story, has a very different story, and that is that sheer contact, as he called it, doesn't in fact dispel prejudice. It seems more likely to increase it. So the book that I wrote 2 or 3 books back on Leading for Change was a reinterpretation of rates in the Free State, in which in fact the relationship between those 4 white boys who abused the 5 workers were in fact very close. They were very intimate. They actually got along very well. But the mere fact that they were together in an unequal set of relationships made them very dangerous to each other. In fact, the white kids were very, very dangerous without realizing it towards the black workers and so on. So the fact that you're together without the necessary preparation, okay, and yeah, I have to congratulate your colleagues here at Stellenbosch University. I've probably had 5 or 6 different groups. My God, you really need to have them all work together. Each group comes with another plan for how to keep our students together and bring together. That's good. That's really good, because simply putting people together doesn't solve anything. You have to work on how you make them respect each other and understand each other, and so on and so forth. And so you have in schools in South Africa at the moment an incredible stress, an incredible anxiety because of the very toxic atmosphere on the outside. So the moment Julius Malema stirs racial hatred with land reform, and we need land reform, don't get me wrong, but when the terms of that debate, okay, are such that it gets everybody's racial nerves, disturbed, then of course you have that reflected when kids come into the class. When you have the Ashwin-Willemse thing, that has a reflection back into schools and society. And so how does one in fact make sure that having some integrated schools enables these young people to be together and so on and so forth. Now, the problem is, of course, the schools themselves don't make much of an effort, because the understanding of most former white schools in South Africa where there is some integration is, you as a black student are coming into the school, you must accept the terms of the school. A very arrogant approach, and so on. So we, a Christian school, the fact that you're Muslim, you chose the school. So when we have the school assembly, which is really a quasi-church meeting on a Monday morning, You can stay in the class if you want to, but this is a Christian school. Now, of course, that's nonsense. No school is a Christian school or a Muslim school for that matter, as I often tell my colleagues on both sides. It is a public school, and that's why it is available and should be available to all our students without discrimination. But you have those things. You try and suggest to Paul Riss or to Stellenbosch boys, just try it, and suggest that they add a code to their sports teams called soccer. And then you'll see the true colors coming out. Okay? Oh no, we don't have enough fields. I remember when the principal of Pretoria Boys, where my son was, I said to him, man, we're good friends, man. Let's just level with each other. Why the hell don't you have soccer? Because my son wanted to play soccer and rugby. He said, no, we don't have enough fields. Have you been to Pretoria Boys? It is larger than parts of Tikkies, of the University of Pretoria. It's a huge campus, but it's that ingrained prejudice because of the association of soccer with black people and so on and so forth. And so the schools really struggle with this issue. They also struggle with understanding that in the 21st century, you cannot continue the practices that you did 100 years ago when it worked for white, in all white schools. And so on. I remember very, very clearly, my daughter was in grade 8 at Pretoria Girls, and she swore, I've never been back to my kids' schools after that. She's got a way of telling you off. And she said, Dad, you will never again come to my school functions because you ask these difficult questions and you embarrass me, And I wanted to know, why is it, in front of all these parents, that my daughter must learn to knit? No, I'm dead serious. She's learning to knit. In the age of computers, in the age of, at Pretoria Girls, every girl knits, like they did 100 years ago. And I said, my kid is going to fly an Airbus across the Atlantic. Why must she knit? And by the way, my boy doesn't knit at the boys' school next door. Oh, Lord. The people who shut me up, by the way, were black parents. Because the black parents themselves, don't want to be disturbed by all of these things. They want their kids to get access to the full cultural package. So don't be confused if you think that every black kid in a former white school, necessarily is aggrieved by these exclusionary practices. That is not the case. What makes it even more difficult from our research in schools is that when it comes to the curriculum, you cannot assume that because there's the same CAPS document or the same, with the formal curriculum, that therefore the teacher in school 1 is doing the same thing as the teacher in school 2. So I had a really smart PhD student, Tobbs Gamedi, and what Tobbs did was to say, I want to look at this happened to be Pretoria Boys, how they teach Sharpeville and Soweto. These are 2 huge events in South Africa's struggle history. Sharpeville 1960, Soweto 1976. So I'm going to look at how they teach it, those 2 episodes at Pretoria Boys. Then I want to look at how they teach the same stuff at Morris Isaacson in Soweto. When I looked at the data, I'm telling you, you could have been in 2 totally different countries. And the point about this is that curriculum is never implemented the way people talk. Curriculum is interpreted. It is interpreted through the biography of the teacher. And that is why this decolonization nonsense is going to take us nowhere. Because you can't have somebody teach decolonization who hasn't come to terms with their own colonial heritage. You can't do that. You teach that curriculum through a particular biography. And so on. And that's why there's a whole lot of simple, I must really make an appointment with the rector because I worry about my favorite university with these notions of changing a few modules here and there and thinking this is decolonization. It's the wrong term for a much more complex problem when it comes to the problem of knowledge. And so all of these things are going on, and there's a whole lot of resentment that these kids, so if you look at the children at UCT who rebelled with Rhodes Must Fall, with 1 or 2 exceptions that include the poo thrower, whom I had coffee with, by the way, for 3 hours. It was the most fascinating coffee I've had with anybody, With the exception of this young man, almost every one of the kids leading the protest came from Sachs and Bishops and these fancy schools. Why? You'd imagine they themselves were part of the privilege. Because by the time they got to UCT, they were so fed up, okay? Because they had access. If you want to read a book that explains this very well in the US context, the title of the book is called The Rage of the Privileged Class. And that's what's happening here. The people who are most upset, that even though Ashwin Willemse has access to super sports set, he is still treated like a second-class citizen. So this is what these students reflect. In fact, a mother just called me the other day, and son is at one of these Stellenbosch schools, and every kid, including some teachers, the top water polo player, refer to him as his nickname is our PDI student, our previously disadvantaged individual student. Now just imagine, you have 5 years of that rubbish every single day. By the time you get to use it, you're ready to explode. Okay? And we don't understand how these microaggressions really undermine the confidence of high achievers in really good schools, and yet they feel they don't belong, and so on. So there's a lot that needs to be done, and I don't want to waste your time, both at the level of overt racism, as you saw in Kudu Roodeplaat and in St. John's College, but also in the ways in which, the subtle ways in which kids feel demeaned, black kids in particular. And so one of my newest doctoral students, Chapiso Matenji, has just done a study on how black parents in Roodepoort manage these conflicting impulses, the impulse to make sure that their child gets the best possible quality education because of the collapse of township schooling, and therefore not to interfere, and that impulse to talk back, to correct what is wrong, and the many different ways in which those parents try to survive without rocking the boat. What I'm trying to paint for you is a picture of how schools, when you get inside of schools, they desegregate, but they don't integrate, and why that is so difficult for the 20% of schools that still struggle with these issues. What are the prospects for social cohesion? I'm not very optimistic, to be honest with you, because at the heart of the struggle of white parents for their children is an attempt to preserve power and privilege. And that is not going to be very easily undone in the majority of these schools. So even in schools where it is so obvious that you can do symbolic reparation with very little consequence, schools like Settlers High, or Jan van Riebeeck High, or C.R. Swart High, or D.F. Milan up here in Belleville, you could go a very long way to building to creating grounds for reconciliation, and for conversation around things that are important. But we don't act until there's a crisis, and then very often that is too late. Any of you are interested, I'll of course put out to the organizers the full paper, but all I wish to say is that the only way in which at schools and university to deal with these incredibly difficult issues is to not take integration for granted, to work very hard at it. My colleagues and I have just put out a book for all these schools. I'm very happy to advertise the book as well. Dylan Ray and Roy Hallenberg and I have put out a book that helps schools to deal with these issues that I've talked about. You almost need a similar book, I think, for universities, to help our young people. The problem, again, is not the students. It's very, very easy to change their minds. The problem is all these other kinds of institutions in which they are engulfed that make it very, very difficult for them to cross over. And then finally, if I may just punt the last book on a high note for you. I've just finished a book called Making Love in a War Zone. This is about young black and white students in South Africa who've become very close friends, and some of them have become, in fact, married. And they did this in the Free State, which I don't suggest you do if you want to live very long. But they did that in defiance. And by the way, for those of you interested, one of the clear demographic issues that came out of this. Almost all of those kids are from Kimberley. And the question is, why are Kimberley students different from the typical Free State student when it comes to being more at ease with race relations? And I think you probably know the answer to that, but it's absolutely fascinating. So I have great faith in young people being able to make that crossing over, but it's going to take a lot of work. It cannot be taken for granted, and we cannot assume that desegregation means integration. Thank you very much.